25 years ago, a terrorist operation was to really underscore what 9/11 was supposed to be about. And it also was the key and the gateway to the 9/11 planes operation. Not many people really talk about this subject. You won't hear a peep from the mainstream media. And generally with the public, hardly anyone knows what this operation is or even about. But this terrorist operation was called the Bojinka plot. What is the Bojinka plot? Well, the Bojinka plot was constructed by two individuals, and you've heard of them. One is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, the man who devised planes to be used as weapons and crashing them into American targets. And the other is Ramzi Yousef. He goes by many aliases, just like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed does. His real name is Abdul Basit Karim. And they're both related. Ramzi Yousef is the nephew to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And they were allegedly born in Balochistan, Pakistan. They also their date of births really vary because really their backgrounds are hard to investigate since they come from a very insular family. Ramzi Yousef was also the mastermind behind the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993. Now, what constituted the Bojinka plot? The Bojinka plot had three phases to it. The first phase was to assassinate U.S. President Bill Clinton at the time. But they found Ramzi Yousef and his cohort, Abdul Hakim Murad, while they were in the Philippines planning this operation, found out that security would be too tight for Bill Clinton to attack. They even tried to devise different ways on how to get to his motor vehicle with a Stinger missile, with a hidden bomb underneath a sewer drain. Too many variables, too many problems. And so they replaced that idea with the assassination of Pope John Paul II, who was to visit the Philippines in 1995 in January. The second phase was to set 11 timing mechanisms on 11 planes from Southeast Asia to the United States, where they would travel over the Pacific Ocean. Each plane would have 1 minute, 1 minute between them in times of explosions. And so when one plane would travel over the Pacific in the middle between the United States and Southeast Asia, it would explode. And then a minute later, the other plane would explode and the debris would be at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Nobody knew what would happen. Third phase was to actually hijack a plane and manually crash it into CIA Langley Headquarters. Allegedly, the first person to devise hijacking a plane and crashing it manually was Abdul Hakim Murad. Now, this information actually came from the interrogation of Abdul Hakim Murad and also from Ramzi Yousef, who was later apprehended a year later. And so take this with a grain of salt, but the operation for this plan is well known because there were multiple financiers of this plot. And who was one of the main financiers was Osama bin Laden. Another was Hambali. That's his nickname. His real name is Ridwan Isamuddin, who was a military tactical leader of the Philippine terrorist organization Jemaah Islamiyah. And another financier, a major financier of the plot, was Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law, Mohammed Jamal Khalifa, who owned many businesses in Saudi Arabia and in the Philippines. He is not generally known to the public, but a couple of years ago, if you can find it on YouTube, Journeyman Pictures did a very rare interview with Mohammed Jamal Khalifa. Another financier is Wali Ka Amin Shah, who was an Afghan, and he was one of an employees of the International Relations Information Center, which is owned by Jamal Khalifa. And this business was a money laundering business where they would get increments of $500 to $1,000 from these people. And also, there were many Saudi donors. Many of these Saudi donors were Wahhabi donors. These are the more radical Islamists inside Saudi Arabia, which is primarily Wahhabi-oriented. In 1994, the planning of the Bojinka plot started with Khalid, Sheikh Mohammed, and Ramzi Yousef devising new ways to attack the United States after the World Trade Center bombing. And so they rented a room, which is called the Dona Josefa Apartments. And on December 8th, Ramzi Yousef moved into one of the rooms of the apartments. The manager of the apartment her name is Edith Guerrera, who rented the room to Ramzi Yousef. A couple of days later, Abdul Hakim Murad, a known associate of Ramzi Yousef, moves in with him in the same apartment. The apartment number was room 603. And so here they started purchasing quantities of nitroglycerin and urea nitrate. Now, the bombs themselves would have many variables and chemicals regarding what constituted the bombs themselves. And so Ramzi Yousef was building bombs called Mark II or micro bombs. These were Casio digital watches, which acted as the timer. Stabilizers would be cotton wool balls, would also constitute an undetectable quantity of nitroglycerin as the explosive. Other ingredients would be urea nitrate, sulfuric acid, nitrobenzenine, silver acetate, and liquid acetone. What would act as the power source would be two 9-volt batteries in each bomb, and the batteries would be connected to a light bulb firmament that would detonate the bomb. And you could wear the watch itself and then use the timer and device. And before you would press the button to the timer, each bomb would have a time connected to it, whether it be an hour, a half hour. So Yousef itself would test these bombs, and the testing started very simply. At first, the very first operational test was inside a mall in a town called Cebu City in the Philippines, and he put it in the generator room of the mall, and it exploded, and it caused minor damage. But the test was to see how the bomb would operate and the damage it would cause. And so it was a small timing mechanism device that didn't do much. On December 1st of 1994, Walid Amin Shah, who visited Murad and Yousef, placed a bomb underneath the seat of the Greenbelt Theater in Manila, Philippines, to test what would happen because the theater seat is similar to a theater seat. So he put it under the seat. The bomb went off and it injured a couple of people. It didn't kill nobody. And Walid Amin Shah was on a motorcycle watching this, and he saw the smoke and people running outside. He drove away. The next step, which would be the biggest step of all, was on December 11th, 1994. Now, Yousef himself would test this, and he used a micro bomb, the Casio bomb that he would use. And so he constructed this in the lavatory of the aircraft. And the aircraft was Philippine Airlines Flight 434, which was a flight from Manila to Narita, Japan, and then stopping to Cebu City, Philippines. Narita, which is a New Tokyo International Airport. So this way, Yousef would get off at this airport, then travel back to the Philippines. And so he set the timer for 4 hours, and this would give him enough time. Philippines airline flight 434 took off, and the bomb exploded over Japan's Okinawa prefecture. Now, there was a person sitting on that seat where he put the timing mechanism. His name was Haruki Igami, and he was killed immediately. And 10 passengers were injured, and there was 273 people on this flight. Miraculously, thankfully to the pilots of the plane, they managed to land it even under those existential threatening circumstances. And there was a hole at the bottom of the plane. And Iwagami's bottom half was totally destroyed. His legs were gone. And so his torso and his shoulders, his head fit into the hole, which kept the air pressure from sucking the plane inside out, which is really a horrible ordeal. It's something really traumatizing to experience. I can't imagine the passengers witnessing this. And the pilots deserve a ton of credit, which under those circumstances, they managed to land the plane. I think, if I'm correct, they received medals from the Japanese government for their heroic efforts in saving the 273 people on the plane. Nevertheless, the test was a success, but Yousef had managed to miscalculate where the fuel tanks were on the flight. Now, the fuel tanks actually were just 3 rows back where that seat was. And if Yousef had calculated correctly, the plane would have exploded in midair, killing everybody on board. Now, the next step was to have these bombs placed on these planes. Now, he was going to have Murad, Walid Amin Shah, and himself place these bombs on these 11 airliners, and they would all be interconnecting flights. And the flights involved would be from Honolulu International Airport in Hawaii, John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York, Los Angeles International, Los Angeles, Chicago O'Hare International Airport, and San Francisco International Airport. From Asia, Kai Tak Airport in Hong Kong, New Tokyo International Airport, Ninoy Aquino International Airport, which is Manila, Philippines, Singapore, Shanghai's airport in Singapore, Bangkok International Airport in Thailand. While they were making the 11 bombs at the Josefa apartments, what happened was that during the early morning hours, Abdul Hakim Murad was mixing a chemical inside the sink, and the water got on top of the chemical itself. This was on January 12th, 1995. And it caused a really acrid chemical reaction. Thick black smoke came out of the windows, and it was so overwhelming, Yousef and Abdul Hakim Murad had to leave the apartment. And as they're leaving, they see other people reacting to the smoke. They're thinking the apartment's on fire. And so the fire department comes. And meanwhile, inside the room is all the vats of chemicals and these incriminating evidences. And most importantly, Ramzi Yousef's laptop, Toshiba laptop, which had the operation and everyone involved on the laptop itself. And Edith Guerra, the manager of the apartments, calls the police, and they arrive. And the first 2 policemen arrive, they leave and just think it's a fire incident. Meanwhile, there's one cop who managed to stay. And I would be remiss in not mentioning her name. Her name was Ada D. Fariscal, and I'm going to spell out the name so you could look her up. AIDA Fariscal. Ida Fariscal. So why am I mentioning her out? Because she decided to go and investigate inside the room of where this smoke was coming from. And when she went inside, she saw overload of incriminating evidence of this being just more than just supposed fire. In fact, it wasn't. There were 4 hot plates, there were packing crates, cotton bales soaked in beige solution, and red, green, blue electrical wiring. There was these vats of sulfate. There was also Bibles and crosses, and there was these uniforms of priests where priests would wear these uniforms. And what the plan was to have Ramzi Yousef and Murad dress as priests and place a bomb nearby where the motorcade, where Pope John Paul II was going to be, and the bomb would explode and hopefully killing Pope John Paul I as well as others residing near it. And so Hakim, Murad, and Yousef are looking, and they're seeing all these people, and Yousef notices that the laptop's left behind, so he tells Murad to go back and get it. And remarkably, Murad loses his, has a momentary lapse of reason, and actually goes back. And while he's walking up the stairs, the Philippine National Police and the firemen and everybody all turn around. They see Murad coming up the stairs to the apartment. He sees that. He then turns around, jets tails, and runs for the hills, not in the direction where Ramzi Yousef is, but due to Murad's clumsiness, there's a tree that fell down prior to this rainstorm that happened the day prior, and he fell over this tree. And they catch him and they detain him and they bring him back to an Air Force base in the Philippines. Meanwhile, Ramzi Yousef quietly just leaves the country, leaving all the incriminating evidence to be collected, which filled 3 police vans. And of course, Hakim Murad was left to his own devices. Now, according to the Philippines National Police, Abdul Hakim Murad was using an alias named Abdul Saeed, and he was held for 67 days in Philippine National Police custody. And he was actually taunting the police at first, but then they really let him have it, and they torture him, and they beat him up. And what got him to crack after all those days was that they threatened to deport him to Israel, where he feared the Mossad there, because the Mossad has really harsh interrogation techniques. And so one investigator named Rodolfo Mendoza, who's a lead terrorism investigator, decides to give Abdul Hakim Murad a hamburger. It's actually McDonald's hamburger. And he gives him the soda. And right there, through that simple act of kindness, Murad opens up to Rodolfo Mendoza and tells him about the plot. He also tells him about sleeper cells that were inside the United States. We're talking about 1995, that were already these Al-Qaeda sleeper cells. They weren't Al-Qaeda, named Al-Qaeda yet, but these terrorist sleeper cells that were already training in flight schools in the United States. Now, this would report back well to a report that you may have heard about, which is called the Phoenix Memo. Now, the Phoenix Memo was a memorandum written by an FBI agent in the Phoenix office named Ken Williams, who had a confidential informant into the Islamic underworld in Phoenix, and he reported back that, yes, there was a lot of unusual Arabs training to go into these flight schools to train on these Boeing simulators and going to crop dusters, learning how to fly even small planes, large Boeing 747s, 757s. So the FBI really just dismissed the Stossers, saying that it was no big deal. There's nothing nefarious about it. Meanwhile, Ken Williams was writing about it, 5 years before it even happened. And then the Phoenix memo was a accumulation of the past 5 years, was finally released in 2001, which is a little bit too late. Which, of course, the FBI in Minneapolis and Phoenix and in New York were complaining that the superiors basically just ignored these warnings about Arabs learning to fly at unusual rates, even for back then. And so Murad actually opens up to Rodolfo Mendoza. He tells him about the plans and operations of hijacking airplanes and crashing them into targets. And Rodolfo Mendoza compiles his lengthy report and sends it to the FBI. And he says it as much later on to an Associate Press report, which you can find on YouTube. Actually tells him that, I gave them this report in 1996, and basically the FBI ignored it. And so here you have the foundations for where the planes operation involved with 9/11 really came from. And many years later, if we're to believe the testimony of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, take this with a grain of salt because it came through torture, but it would lead back to the Bojinka plot, where the idea for 9/11 came from. And if the Bojinka plot actually happened, it would dwarf what happened on 9/11 because, according to Yousef, the plan was to kill anywhere between 4,000 to 6,000 people. And this would involve an international outrage because it involved planes from all ports from Southeast Asia and the United States. And so when we talk about real anomalies regarding the events of September 11th, we shouldn't be talking about the outrageous conspiracy theories. We should be talking about the real anomalies which are hidden from public view, because it would show that these agencies like the FBI or the CIA and foreign intelligence agencies like the Saudis and the Pakistanis and the Israelis knew about certain plots and certain terrorist organizations involved with these plots and the financiers involved with them, and basically ignored them. Because when you look at the overall scheme of things, the grander picture is regarding the United States and the foreign policy involving some of these countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, which have a major implicating force. And when you look at 9/11 or the Bojinka plot or the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, not many people died because of these incidents. And of course, these are terrible terrorist incidents. But if you look at the overall broader picture of regarding the foreign policies regarding these incidences, and Ramzi Yousef and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and Mohammed Atta and numerous terrorists will tell you later on that the purpose for these incidences was not basically on that they hated you for their freedoms, which is what the State Department wanted you to believe, the public to believe, but what was kept ignored from you was that it all entailed the United States' disastrous foreign policy regarding Saudi Arabia and Israel. And when you look at those areas, and not that the more simplistic terms of no planes and no hijackers, you'll get a much bigger picture involving what took place in these incidents, who is involved, and what were the primary reasons and goals involving these operations.